Welcome to Processing Distortion. I'm Peter B. Collins. This is the podcast where we look at misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, and outright lies. As we speak in early June, we just witnessed a bizarre sequence of events in Washington, D.C., leading up to the Memorial Day break, and then the remarkable session in the United States Senate on the Sunday night, May 31st, as the clock was ticking on the expiration of three elements of the Patriot Act. To get some commentary on this, we talk once again with Russ Tice. He worked at the National Security Agency until he left, I peg it as about 2004, and he has been remarkably forthright and very candid about his own feelings about the way the agency that he worked for and took so much pride in has been turned on domestic targets, including the mass dragnet surveillance of Americans on a daily basis. Russ, it's always great to talk to you. Thanks for joining me today.
Oh, it's good to be back.
So without any setup or, my ability to put words in your mouth or poison your thoughts, as you have watched the Senate wrangle with the so-called USA Freedom Act and the president adopt talking points that we've heard from the other party in the past, how did you feel about the wrangling over the extension of these elements of the Patriot Act?
Well, I like to look back at a history of what's going on here. We basically had the NSA violating the FISA Act for several years, up until I do believe it was 06, 07, or probably beginning of 07, when finally they were forced, after the New York Times article came out and some other revelations, that they were violating the original FISA law. So then, all of a sudden, they said they're going to stop, and they're going to have. Then they put in for the FISA Amendment Act. Mm-hmm. All right. So, but while they're doing that, they're still spying on American citizens. So while they're doing that, then they come up with these interpretations of the Patriot Act that even the framers of the Patriot Act are shrugging their shoulders, going, what the hell are you talking about? It doesn't say anywhere in the Patriot Act that the Patriot Act allows the NSA to spy on every single American citizen. So, and then there's the 702 provision from what they passed for the amendment of FISA, that's mm-hmm. some kind of twisted, interpretation of that, and then there's the Reagan-era Executive Order 32111.
No. It's 12333.
12333. And it's like, and of course, these are all secret interpretations of things that have been twisted in their twisted, little minds to be able to allow themselves to do this stuff. And of course, all secret, no one can know. And I just think, now, thanks to Mr. Snowden, the American people know that NSA and the intelligence community, they lie repeatedly. They lie, when a few items come out, they lied to cover that, and then once that those lies got torn down, they fall back to the next line of defense, which is another wall of lies. So why on earth would anyone trust the National Security Agency and the intelligence community to tell the truth? Why, especially when all these provisions that are coming out require the agency and the intelligence community to tell the lawmakers what they're doing, because there's no pushback. There's no way. The information has to come from the agency, and why does anyone believe them? We have a known liar. We have Alexander and Hayden and Clapper mm-hmm. that are known habitual liars when it comes to these things, and yet I see them in these venues where they're talking probably for $400,000 or $500,000 a speech, and everybody's clapping and hooray for you. Like, these people are known liars and criminals.
Now, Russ, did you manage to watch any of the proceedings in the Senate on the Sunday evening of May 31st?
I didn't watch any of them. Mm-hmm. No. I knew what was going to happen.
Well, let me describe what I saw and get your reaction, because it ties together with something that you disclosed to me and Sibel Edmonds shortly after Ed Snowden surfaced. And that is, I watched as they set up this program or a protocol for debate, and they said, okay, the Republicans get half an hour, the Democrats get half an hour. And so both sides basically ran out the clock, primarily offering eulogies and condolences regarding the death that had just been announced of Vice President Biden's son, Beau. And so there was very little debate. It was really just Senator McConnell who, wrung his hands that his junior senator and the man that he's endorsed for president, Rand Paul, had put a procedural block on moving forward for a vote that was a reluctant choice for McConnell to embrace the House version of the USA Freedom Act. And what was remarkable is that while Senator Ron Wyden and Heinrich from New Mexico did offer some procedural support for Rand Paul, he was the only one who spoke in opposition to the extension of these three authorities under the Patriot Act: the roving wiretap, the lone wolf provision, and the metadata collection of our telephone records. And so I found that remarkable. And as I watched, I was thinking of what you told me, which is that you saw the paperwork for the installation of wiretaps and other surveillance on top elected officials, including members of Congress. And, Russ, were they silenced during that critical debate because of something that was collected in a wiretap or an intercept on, say, Senator Feinstein or Senator Hatch, or pick your name?
I've always said I do not know the answer to that. I don't know whether the information that they get collected word for word on senators and congressmen, and this is when I had my hands on this was 2004 2005 time frame. That's when I saw these things literally in my hand, and when they were going after these people. So what did J. Edgar Hoover do with the information that he had? I think it's just logical to assume that anyone that has that kind of power and that kind of information is going to use it to their benefit. In this case, probably the intelligence community. Now, like I said, I don't know that for sure, but there's an awful lot of politicians out there that have probably people like Hastert, who started out in Congress with like a net worth of $250,000 and walks out the door with like $17 million. Well, we're talking about some dirty dealings that allow these judges and these politicians to become very wealthy when they get into office. So I have a feeling that, yes, these people are being blackmailed, and these are our elected officials.
Now, since you mentioned former Speaker Hastert, he helped ram the Patriot Act through in 2001, and he is now, being tried on elements that are included in the Patriot Act: the reporting of bank transactions, the structuring of deposits and withdrawals. And curiously, he's not being charged with either paying or being blackmailed. And the person identified as Person A is still not identified, not indicted. And so there are many curious aspects about this, but fundamentally, Denny Hastert is being arraigned on June 4th today on charges that might not have been brought if the Patriot Act had never been passed.
Isn't that a coincidence? It's just crazy, isn't it? But what kind of information did NSA have on Dennis Hastert in the first place? Did they know that he was buggering little boys when he was a high school teacher? I don't know, but these are the kind of things that could easily be used to control someone, to make sure that they vote the way you want them to vote. And that whole thing with Hastert is just kind of, it looks like a case of extortion against him. What about the charges against person A or whatever. That's just one of the craziest stories going right now.
Yeah. So as you look at the big picture here, we're a couple of years removed from Ed Snowden's revelations, and your whistleblowing colleagues, including Bill Binney and Tom Drake, have been quoted. And I don't want to lump you together with Dan Ellsberg because he's from a much earlier generation of whistleblowers. But Ellsberg and Drake have both described this as at least a victory in symbolic terms, because the Congress was forced to debate these issues. McConnell didn't get what he wanted in terms of a so-called clean extension of the Patriot Act. And so while they do describe the USA Freedom Act as not a big change and just baby steps toward reform, they do feel that this is a pivotal moment. What is your take, Russ?
Well, I don't see that at all. Now they're just going to let the phone company have the records and tell them to keep them indefinitely so that they can access whenever they care to.
Wait a minute, Russ. The NSA operators will have to click on a completely different website or database to get that information.
It might inconvenience them for 2 or 3 extra clicks on their mouse, right?
Yeah, right.
So, here's the thing. The apparatus that NSA has set up to tap into every node in this country, all the different communications junctures in this country, like there in San Francisco, they did that all over the country. They did it in New York and New Jersey, and they did it in Texas, and they did it up in Seattle. They've done it all over to the major nodes for the major telecommunication companies, and that apparatus exists today. So until that apparatus is destroyed, there is no credibility to say that NSA does not have access to that information, because they do, and not only the metadata, and they do word for word. And that's why that huge facility was built there in Bluffdale, Utah. If the only thing you're going to do is collect metadata, you don't need some monster facility with 1 million or 2 square feet of computer storage space for just metadata. That is something that's something that you're going to need for massive amounts of data. We're talking about yottabytes of information, and that's something that's going to be word for word, which is exactly what NSA was doing, and they've still lied about it. Whether they're still doing the word for word, I don't know. But they certainly were, and they even opened up that Bluffdale facility earlier than they said they were going to, and that's what they were storing there.
Now, describe what you mean by word for word, because Senator McConnell reassured me and any other American watching C-SPAN on Sunday night that it's only the call record information, the numbers that were connected, the duration of the call, and that they never listen in. That's what Senator McConnell told us.
Well, what is their definition of they never listen in? Are they saying that, they're talking about a human intelligence analyst? Well, in that case, they're right, because there's not enough intelligence analysts that you could possibly hire to listen to every communication that's going on. The thing is, it's all been automated. Everything has been, there's filters involved, there's all of the information. For instance, if you get some kind of a spam recording to buy Viagra or something, that sort of thing goes into a filter and gets kicked out immediately. So there are some things that get kicked out immediately, but everyday communications, and this was happening up until the revelations from Mr. Snowden, were going word for word, except for the things that got kicked out because they knew they were basically spam, garbage, type phone calls. But up until then, everything was being collected word for word, and that's yourself talking to your doctor. That's someone talking to their lawyer. That's some guy who's messing around on his wife talking to his lover. That's little 13-year-old Sally talking to little 13-year-old Janie about how cute Johnny is. That all of that information, word for word, was being sucked up, and I have a feeling probably still is, and going to the big facility to be contained in a big database to be accessed at some point in the future, or possibly never, but nonetheless that information is available indefinitely.
Russ, when you worked at NSA, was the Stingray technology or the Dirt Box, was that in existence, and had it been deployed?
Not that I know of. Now, there are systems where the agency has like special vans that go out that collect things. Mm-hmm. But back in the day, those targets were not supposed to be American citizens. Back when we adhered to the law.
Yeah. How quaint! How quaint that you adhered to the law.
Yeah, imagine that, adhering to the law and their Constitution. What quaint ideas.
So during there was about a 36-hour period between midnight Sunday, when these authorities technically lapsed, and Tuesday night when the president renewed them by signing the USA Freedom Act. And while we were vulnerable, two things happened. One was the FBI shot and killed a suspect on the streets of Boston. I'm still awaiting accurate information about that, so I'll just treat it as a report at this point. But the other thing that happened was the Associated Press released an investigative report showing that the FBI has a fleet of over 115 Cessnas or other small fixed-wing aircraft that fly over urban and rural areas. And they tell us that they're primarily equipped with high-def video equipment, but we know that they can also be equipped with Stingrays or these dirt boxes. And they can suck up the information on cell phones within a specific radius, and it's not just metadata. The reports that I have on it are pretty clear about that. So I found it very interesting that at this time when we're wrangling over a very narrow set of very modest, extremely tiny reforms, that other programs continue unabated, and there's very little comment on that from people in the corporate media or our elected officials.
That's correct. So now we've got the FBI in on the deal, and they're giving this information, they're giving this capability to local police departments, I'm told. There's one down in Florida somewhere where they were using this, and a judge was ordering them to give up the information on the Stingray, and the police department conveniently had the feds come raid their facility to take out all the information on the Stingray.
That's Tallahassee.
Yeah, so it could not be given to the judge. That's contempt of court, but they don't care. Mm-hmm. So it's now when you talk about putting it on an aircraft, you got to understand how a system like that works. It works by line of sight.
Yep.
So typically a line of sight for terrestrial, which means close to the ground, is between 30 and 40 miles, depending on where you're at, or if you're in a plain state like Texas or somewhere, longer. Mm-hmm. But because of the curvature of the Earth, you lose your line of sight at some point, and just like you would at sea if you have a radar or something on a ship on the ocean. But once you put that in an aircraft, what you do is you vastly increase your line of sight capability. Mm-hmm. So that thing, depending on how much power you have to suck in what you're sucking in, you put a good power generator on an airplane and get it up high enough, that line of sight now becomes hundreds of miles, a couple hundred miles or so. So, then they say, "Oh, this is localized." Well, that's of course nonsense, because those capabilities, those systems, basically not only do they suck in everything, but they fool a cell phone into giving up the key codes to allow everything to be decoded, so that the plain text word for word can be collected.
Yeah.
So and of course they're doing everything they can to hide this from the courts and ultimately being told to the public.
Well, and let me just put a finer point on that, Russ. I think that the FBI is actively engaged in obstruction of justice when they, impose these non-disclosure agreements on a local police agency that accepts a stingray. And then they're told you cannot disclose this to the judge. And by the way, you can use parallel construction as an investigative process to arrive at the same point while kind of excluding any mention of the stingray as the entry point to the opening in the investigation.
Yeah, of course they're going to omit the information so that no one can know that it's happening. And of course, the person that's being prosecuted, who has the right under discovery to know this, could end up in jail without knowing what's going on. NSA, with the collection that they were doing, like for instance against Jim Risen and myself, they were telling the FBI and the Department of Injustice that they had to have parallel construction so that they didn't want them to the grand jury to know that they were collecting word for word everything we were saying to one another. Mm-hmm. And that's so what here's ultimately what's going on. They want to have legal justification for the metadata because they want to be able to use the metadata in court cases with a grand jury so that they say, and look what happened to Jeffrey Sterling. People say metadata doesn't mean anything. Jeffrey Sterling just got sentenced to, 40 months or so in jail on basic metadata that all it showed was that there were conversations between his phone and a phone from a news reporter from the New York Times, and that's all they had, and they put him in jail for it. So,
and I'm told
they could have been. First of all, maybe it wasn't them they were talking. It was somebody else on their phones, but they could have been reciting poetry for all we know.
Well, and a courtroom reporter who witnessed that exchange or that testimony in the Sterling trial said that the total elapsed time of on the phone chats between Risen and Sterling was less than 6 minutes. And to imagine that Sterling exposed, that Aladdin program in 6 minutes or less over the phone is pretty bizarre. I mean, first of all, a trained CIA agent would likely have the skills and instincts to avoid that.
Well, absolutely. Now, remember, I'm from the NSA, and I have a signals intelligence background, so I know how important keeping your communications secure are. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, in the very beginning, when I was first talking to reporters, the reporters are, when I'm trying to say, we need to take very specific precautions about our communications, and they're looking at me like I'm crazy. And, of course, what did NSA try to pin on my forehead? That I was crazy. So it was kind of very insidious the way they put that together, because back in those days, reporters didn't understand the threat that was against their own communications, and they were kind of lazy, and they didn't want to have to, look what Greenwald, when he was first trying to be contacted by Snowden, he didn't want to deal with what are these security measures, encryption, the hell with this guy, I don't care about him. I mean, basically, Snowden had to beat him over the head with a damn 2x4 to get his frickin' attention. So,
And Russ, coming back to the issue of domestic surveillance and what is admissible in court, what is revealed by the prosecution, we have an ongoing case, a trial underway in Chicago right now. There's a 20-year-old suspect named Adel Daoud, and he is accused of accepting a bomb from an FBI agent and then trying to detonate it. And in the course of this, his attorneys got the trial court judge to agree to order disclosure of relevant FISA court rulings and access to any documentation at the FISA court related to surveillance of this individual, Daoud. And the trial court judge said okay, and in short order, the appeals court moved faster than most people would expect And within a few days after oral arguments, they shut that down and said, oh, no, the FISA court is secret. And so we see these catch-22s that prevent the system from working and that protect the domestic surveillance that violates the Constitution, the Fourth Amendment, in very clear ways. And this is aided and abetted by judges in this case.
Yeah, in this case, we're talking about the Fifth Amendment, which allows a defendant to have a right to see the evidence that's been brought before him and know where that evidence came from. So the Constitution means nothing to these people, and some of them are judges that it means nothing to. It's the same old that these judges are willing just to fold like a house of cards and say, well, we defer to the judgment of the executive because we have to protect national security. Where does it say that in the Constitution?
Let me turn then to the president, the executive who has presided over the extension and the what I consider to be the solidification of various surveillance programs, including those that operate on U.S. citizens in the United States. And we are just learning that since 2012, without public notice or debate, the Obama administration expanded the NSA's warrantless surveillance of Americans' international Internet traffic. We're told it was to search for evidence of hackers. But this, once again, is an expansion of what I consider to be extra-legal, if not flatly illegal and unconstitutional behavior by our government. And this had to be directly authorized by the president, who in the last 2 years has been spending all this time wringing his hands in public and talking about how, we need to have a conversation about the balance between security and privacy.
Yeah, and that happened right after Mr. Snowden's revelations started coming out, didn't it? Mm-hmm. Before that, and that's the difference, between Mr. Snowden and the rest of us. The rest of us didn't have enough guts to come forth with NSA's own documentation because we knew where we would end up. We'd either end up in jail or hiding out in Moscow or something. Mr. Snowden went the extra mile and totally fell on the sword. So now, pressure's being to bear, and things are coming out drib by drib about how horrible what NSA is doing, the PRISM, and in this case, and that case, and everybody's. I remember once you asked me about all these social network programs, and at that time I didn't know specifically that they were being targeted, but I told you that NSA had access to all of them if they wanted them. Well, of course, they wanted them, and Mr. Snowden proved that. So, it's disingenuous of our own president to come out and say, we need to have this conversation. They certainly didn't want to have the conversation before Mr. Snowden came out with his things. And the rest of us were just deemed to be nut jobs or disgruntled employees or, people that didn't have their program and they were seeking revenge, all the things that they threw at me and Bill Binney and Kurt Wybie and Tom Drake. But once Mr. Snowden came out with what he came out, that was their own documentation. There's no way of refuting it. And our president, to be quite honest, I believe, is being blackmailed by the NSA and the intelligence community. So what kind of dirt do they have on him? That's kind of the only thing, in my opinion, that could really, answer the question as to why he went from being Mr. We're going to, have civil liberties and make sure our country doesn't spy on us like that other president, W. Bush, and then basically he gets into office and he just doubles and triples and quadruples the capabilities of the same.
Well, and Spencer Ackerman at The Guardian wrote a brilliant piece that was published this week, the first week of June, where he basically compared the president's words with his actions. And it's very clear that it's highly hypocritical and contradictory. The president claims that by signing the USA Freedom Act, he has led reform. And you and I know that that's bullshit. that all they've done is rearrange the deck chairs a little bit to make them look different, but the net effect is the same, and the vast majority of domestic surveillance programs are completely unaffected by the legislation that he just signed claiming to be reform.
That's correct. Yeah, it's we've rearranged the deck chairs, and then of course some in the corporate media are claiming that these are wonderful reforms that are going to keep Americans communications safe or what have you. It's a bunch of nonsense, and of course the corporate media that they're doing what can be expected of the corporate media.
Well, finally, Russ, I want to get your reaction to this, and this story just broke a few hours ago. It's my friend and colleague Jason Leopold at Vice News, and he got some documents from the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, released, and they have a task force of several hundred people who are working to try to assess what was lost in the leaks that Ed Snowden perfected. And it is a little bit stunning because for the first time we are learning that the number of 1.7 million files appears to be accurate, and at as many as 900,000 of those were DOD files from the Pentagon, not from the NSA. So it appears that what he gathered, now, from what we know, most of the defense files have not been leaked or published in any way that I'm aware of. But it appears that he actually grabbed more from the Pentagon than he did from Fort Meade.
Before I worked at NSA, you know where I worked, right?
I think you worked at the Pentagon, yes.
I worked at DIA for 4 years before I worked at NSA.
Mm-hmm.
I was the NSA liaison, though. So, so I'm very familiar with DIA, being that I worked there. Matter of fact, when 9/11 happened, I was right there at Bolling Air Force Base at DIA watching the Pentagon burn from my boss's office. But, there are certain capabilities, and I have a feeling, of course, I haven't talked to Mr. Snowden about this, that he was probably in the vetting stage of going through a lot of, it's an awful lot of documents, when probably Bart Gellman at the Washington Post basically put the thumb on top of him when they went to the government. So because I know for 2 weeks before Mr. Snowden became known in the press, that NSA was running around with their hair on fire, their security office, because they knew they had a leak. They had a major leak. Now, and that's what my source told me. And at the time, I didn't know who that source was, but I knew that they were going crazy because I was trying to set up a meeting with our little committee because I had found out or heard from an FBI agent that the NSA was collecting word for word everything every American citizen was saying, and that was the Tim Clementi guy back then.
Yeah.
So I was trying to set up a meeting with our people, with my contacts inside the agency, and they're all going, "Holy crap! It's it's hard to get anything done right now because they're all running around looking for a mole, a leak, and with their hair on fire." So it made it very difficult at that time for us to get our little meeting together, because now, of course, then of course a couple weeks later, I found out that they were looking for Ed Snowden. But
the meeting, you're
at least 2 weeks that they had a major problem. I have a feeling it came from a news reporter. I think it was Gelman, but.
And just to clarify, Russ, the meeting you're talking about is with a group of fellow whistleblowers.
These are people that are inside the agency that still work there.
I see. Okay.
And I'm their spokesman. So, for instance, how do I know that NSA was collecting word for word everything, like 2012, and putting it at the Bluffdale facility? I mean, I left NSA in 2005.
Right.
The only reason I know these things are because of my friends that are still at NSA that are telling me these things, at the risk of their own careers and perhaps their own freedoms.
Well, then, Russ, let me give you a platform here. Is there anything that they have been communicating to you that they want the American public to know?
I think probably if they could, I mean, a lot of things have come out, and they've known some of these things. Some of them they don't. But I think it's that not everyone who works at NSA is on board with what's going on here. There are a lot of good people that work at NSA that are appalled at what's happened to NSA. I loved the place. I consider it a goddess that I used to just enjoy going to work for her. And that goddess got turned into an ugly Medusa Gorgon, a monster. And it happened right in front of us. And we're all just aghast at what has happened to an agency that we loved. Now, remember, these are people that they have mortgages, they have kids in school, they have all kinds of commitments. So, it's hard for them to just come out and destroy their lives. That's why, I became their spokesperson and started, talking to the press about the illegal and unconstitutional things that the NSA was doing. Those people, some of them are still active employees of the agency. Mm-hmm. But because of, things in life that, require someone to, they haven't come out because they're concerned of their own freedom and their own careers and these legislation that wants to take people's pensions away from them. Mm-hmm. So they have a valid reason not to want to become public. So ultimately, and we call it the committee. When we set up the committee, I was already known to be to found out what they did and all the things that NSA did to me, and that's when they said, Russ, you can be our spokesman. I was like, okay. So that's how I know an awful lot about what I know, especially after I left NSA, mm-hmm. because I don't have access to it anymore. But I have friends that work there, and I think if they wanted to get out anything, they would say that there are people there, including themselves, that are just appalled at what has happened at NSA, and they certainly do not agree with it.
Russ, as we wrap this up, I just want to float the big troubling issue to me that all of this leads to, and that is we have so much secrecy that it enables the development of fictional narratives. And I think there's a lot of fictional narrative that is circling related to the Islamic State, related to the actual level of threat to our domestic territory. I'm avoiding using the word homeland, sorry. And my fear is that we are becoming so detached from reality that the created reality, the concocted reality, the fictional reality that is the basis of official government policy is going to lead us to a tremendous crash, because at some point we can't continue to create and maintain our own fictional reality.
Right, because they have to operate in an environment of fear. That's the Orwellian blueprint. You have to have continual fear, and you have to scare the public into giving away their liberties and their freedoms. And I mean, every time we have something that's about to come up, then we have one of these entrapments by the Department of Injustice and the FBI, where some clown who doesn't like the government or whatever, or maybe envisions himself as a jihadist or something, who would the only of his own wherewithal has a screwdriver, to try to dismantle the Brooklyn Bridge or something. But then the FBI finds this person and then enables him with a blowtorch, and it's some I don't know, some kind of bomb or made out of who knows what, mm-hmm. and then basically leads them by the nose ring through the process, and gives them the funding and everything, and provides them with the materials, and probably gives them the manual on how to build a bomb or whatever. And then once they foster this moron to the point where they can say, okay, now you have a bomb with a phony bomb with a red button. And then they get them to the point where they can push the red button, and then they say, and then they descend on this poor idiot, and then of course they come on TV and claim that they've captured a major terrorist operation and yada, and the people should be concerned that other domestic terrorists are out there like this. Come on, it's all created. The threat is created by our own officials that are fostering the Orwellian climate of fear that is required to allow them to get away with what they're doing. It just happens over and over again. I just shake my head. And, of course, the mainstream media is, boy, they're all over it, And the American people are just out there thinking that this is the status quo.
Well, Russ, as always, I appreciate your candor and your commitment to our Constitution. And I also respect your work and the regard that you have for the agency before it went rogue. And I appreciate that you make that distinction and are willing to speak up about the wrongful actions of the NSA. And I just want to stipulate that I've had many conversations with you, and you've made it very clear you would never compromise America's real security. But you're also not buffaloed by these phony claims that we must trade privacy for a false sense of security.
Well, I appreciate that, and yeah, that's where I stand. I was an NSA officer, I was a DEA officer, or a Defense Intelligence officer, and my job was to literally spy on other countries and entities that potentially could be a real threat to the United States. Some weapon system that could be a danger to our fleet, or some missile system that could be a danger to our aircraft. These sort of things that are really important to keep us safe. Then imagine, here I am, and I'm Mr. Red, White, and Blue, wave the flag, and get into the office early and leave late, and then all of a sudden I find out that we're taking our capabilities, turning them inwards against our own people. It was a brick to the head, and oh my God! Since that day, I've just been aghast that our country has come to this.
Russell Tice, NSA whistleblower. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me on, Peter.
Thanks for listening to Processing Distortion. As always, I welcome your feedback and comments. Email Peter at peterbcollins.com.